Now, there's little doubt that language is a central and founding aspect of the human experience. But of course, there are other animals that also convey meanings to other members of their species. And a good question is, how different is that from what we do? Is it just, a small quantitative difference? We just happen to have, a giant vocabulary and we speak about many more things than animals might. Or is it a radically different thing? Um, and see, for example, the book gives you a couple wonderful examples of honeybees or ants that use several forms and birds, and they use several forms of communications. However, overall, most people seem to agree that animal communication tends to be a rigid, usually small set of signals that stand for very specific things, typically related to things like danger or feeding or things that, sources of food, that sort of thing. And typically they refer to something that is right there and then, meaning something that is observable here and now. Human language, on the other hand, doesn't seem to have these constraints. In fact, the French philosopher Descartes, that we spoke about in the first week, had already realized that there's a certain creativity and infinity to human language. And he recognized in that one of the most beautiful examples of why humans are different than other species. And indeed, human language tends to have a number of founding characteristics. And there are 5 that I would like to cover, particularly in this class, which you see shown here, but I want to take them one by one. So first, language is symbolic. Now, what I mean by symbolic is that it makes use of an arbitrary relation between sound and meaning. Now, if you take this idea right here, different languages use different labels to refer to it. In English, we say dog, but there's nothing doggy about it. There's nothing that connects the utterance and the word dog with the idea of a dog. There's nothing intrinsically doggy about the word dog. We just all agreed that that's how we would have referred to this particular object. We could have called it cat and agreed that cat referred to this thing here, but that's just not what we did. And other languages, of course, use completely different labels, right? You might say, I think, gao in Chinese. You could say skili. In Greek, let's see, there's chien in French, can in Italian, chelev in Hebrew, etc., etc., etc. And again, in none of these languages, there's any relationship between the word itself, the utterances, the sound that we make to refer to it, and the dog. There are a few, there are a small number of words known as onomatopoeia, which where the sound actually is an emulation of the sound of the word matches the sound produced by something, the ting of a bell or the buzz of a bee. These are words which were created because they sound like the object. So there's a relationship between the sound that we use and the idea we're describing. But generally speaking, for most words, it's the case that there's an arbitrary and symbolic relationship between an utterance, a word, and a certain meaning. Now, second, and perhaps this is one of the most founding ideas, or rather characteristics of human language, and this is exactly what Descartes was referring to, is that of discrete infinity, or really generativity. See, language is made, human language is certainly made of a finite set of words, but you can combine them in infinite ways to create an infinity of potential meanings. Take this example. Jack hates cheese. My roommate heard the rumor that Jack hates cheese. I told her that my roommate heard a rumor that Jack hates cheese. It disturbed Mary when I told her that my roommate heard a rumor that Jack hates cheese. I was amazed that it disturbed Mary that I told, etc. etc. Professor Monty spent way too much of his lecture talking about how I was amazed that it disturbed Mary when I told her that my roommate, etc. It really bothered me, etc., etc., etc. We can take a finite number of units, of elements, words, and create a potential infinity of meanings. You can take any sentence and add Aisha thinks that at the beginning of it, and make a perfectly fine, well-formed sentence. Of course, it means something else, but you can create an infinity of possible meanings starting from a finite number of elements, words. Now, another key aspect of language is structure dependence. See, the idea that meaning is conferred through a specific arrangement of symbols. Just knowing what symbols are there in a sentence, it's just not enough to know what is being said, to know what state of affairs is being referred to. You need to know how exactly each piece, each element relates to the other elements in the sentence. So in this sense, language is really governed by rules that impart meaning and define which combination of elements are acceptable and which are not. And if you take sentences as an example, Aliyah pushed Sojun, you know exactly what happened. Aliyah is pushing Sojun. But if I say Sojun pushed Aliyah, exactly same tokens. It's still the same three tokens. Aliyah, pushing, and Sojun. But it's obvious that the first two sentences, who's doing the pushing, completely different. So the exact same tokens, just in a different order, the meaning is different. This is what we mean by structure dependence. Similarly, if I order them yet again in a different way, it doesn't work anymore. If I said pushed Aliyah Sojun, you might understand what I'm trying to say, but it's grammatically incorrect. Or if I said Sojun Aliyah pushed, same thing. So the way in which we sequence the elements of a sentence determine whether it's acceptable or not, and what is actually being said. Because given the exact same tokens, given these exact same three words, I can say the two opposite things about who's pushing who. So this is what we mean by structure dependence. Then another a key aspect of human language, and this is yet another aspect that makes it so different from animal communication, is known as displacement. The idea that we can, using language, we can think of and we can refer to ideas or elements that are not right there in front of us, that are not being sensed right here and right now. So we can talk about anything at any point in time, no problem, thanks to language. And in this respect, we seem to be pretty much unique in being able to talk about sort of things that are remote in space or in time from the place where you're describing them and from where you're talking. Now, you might remember from earlier, either from reading the textbook or from sort of my brief mention of it, that honeybees do use the waggle dance to communicate the location of some food that is somewhere else that is not being sensed immediately. However, this is really a really tiny tiny example. The degree of displacement, even in this case, is extremely limited. Bees can only refer to the very last piece of food they saw. They can't say, oh, 3 days ago, the food was to the left of that big tree. They can't do that. They can't say tomorrow's food will be, they can only refer, there's only one displacement they can do. The very last piece of food I'm describing is the one that I'm dancing about right now. But that's it. You can't say, oh, 5 days ago, I found a piece of food under, a birch tree. You can't do that. So in this sense, even in the one case, or, one of a handful of cases where there is some displacement, meaning it is possible to talk about something that is not right there and then being sensed, for example, a remote in space source of food, it's extremely restricted. You can only talk about the very last one. And you can say, hey, I just found this one right here, right now. Let's go check it out. But again, you cannot talk about some other thing displaced in time. Of course, you can talk about it in the future, or you can talk about it more in the past than the last piece of food. So even when we find examples of very light displacement, they're extremely restricted compared to me being able to say, exactly 5 months ago, I saw the American classic, American Pie, right? You know exactly how displaced this is. You know exactly how displaced in time, and you know how displaced in space this is. Right? This, it doesn't seem like any other animal is capable of such amount of displacement. And indeed, this allows us to talk about stuff that we've never seen. We can talk about quarks and neutrons and dark matter particles that by definition we cannot see. So despite something being completely outside the realm of what we can sense, thanks to displacement, we can talk about it. And finally, the last aspect that I want to cover in this class, although we're going to cover this more extensively a little bit later, is the idea that language is organized at multiple levels. And the typical levels of organization might be the level of sounds, so phonology, the level of basic meanings, morphology, the level of how we string together sequences of words, syntax, and it can go on the level of the paragraphs, text, etc., etc. Although we will only cover phonology, morphology, and syntax.